The Ghostly Light of Hallow's Eve, a 100-Hall short story. The sign read 1 drop of soul per ride. It cost 6 drops to experience the haunted Ferris wheel, so Luca's price wasn't so bad considering. The guillotine rose above the street on a wooden platform, a black monolith with an angled blade stained with blood. The steel edge shone with a luster that would have made Marie Antoinette's knees quake. Luca had a good spot near the entrance of the carnival, not too far from the food court, but also not close enough that the grease from the funnel cake booth would have coated everything like swamp gas. It was an idyllic night. The surrounding skyscrapers reflected the full moon, and a cool October breeze muted the distant car noises. The perfect ambience. Luca had everything he wanted, except customers. "This looks dumb," said a teenager in jeans and a Garbage Kings t-shirt, flicking the meticulously hand-painted Halloween sign with his novelty wand. His friends were lost in the haunting glow of their cell phones, mouths gapping like jack-o'-lanterns. Luca leered over the rope line that had been made to look like fresh intestines. He'd enchanted his voice to sound like an old man who drank a bottle of whiskey and smoked a pack of cigarettes before breakfast. Experience your death before the crowd. Hear them jeer and cheer. Know what it's like for your head to tumble into the basket, said Luca, reaching with his bone-stretched arm to place a pale hand on the wand-holding teenager's shoulder. Only 1 drop of soul. The kid shrugged away from Luca's touch, not in horror as he'd hoped, but with an exaggerated eye roll. "This is the lamest booth in the whole carnival, dude. So what? You grew your arms longer, and you can cast some stupid illusion that makes you think you died. You should check out the Sparrow's booth. Her voodoo is the real deal. Some kid shit himself last night." The trio wandered away, leaving Luca stewing in his failure. The Sparrow's booth. He didn't need that high school punk to remind him that she'd had 2 and 3 hour lines all carnival, and it wasn't even Halloween yet. She was the whole reason he'd made a booth by himself, rather than with a group. Everyone in Oestomancium, hell, everyone in the whole 100 halls, knew her name. Every year she'd trounced him in the contest, taking first prize, and reminded him of it all year long. 4 years in a row he'd endured her taunts. This was their last year. If he didn't win now, it would sit on his bones like acid forever. A mother and her adolescent daughter, in matching overalls, wandered up to his booth. They eyed the sign suspiciously, then with a few glances made their choice. "Welcome to the Halloween. I'll be your executioner on this dark night. 1 soul drop please," he said, holding out his pale hand. The mother fished the novelty coin from her front pouch pocket. Luca watched the girl for signs of anticipation, but she seemed rather unimpressed. He hoped to change that once she'd been under the blade. If a few people started talking about the experience, maybe he'd get enough customers to at least fill up his rope lines. "Come with me," said Luca, limping up the wooden scaffolding. He positioned her in the guillotine, coaxed her forward until her neck rested on the velvet curve, then cinched her wrists into Velcro cuffs. Before he stood back up, she asked, "This is going to be cool, right?" Not breaking character, Luca moved back towards the lever with a foot-dragging limp. He threw his hands skyward, letting the black robes dance around his wrists, and called out in a booming voice. "On this night, within the long shadow of All Souls' Eve, we've come to enact retribution upon," he paused, remembering he'd forgotten to ask her name, "this urchin for her crimes in the city of Invictus." Focusing on the spell took concentration, but he was aware that a few groups had stopped and were waiting to see if the conclusion would be worth it. The moment the spell finished, the phase tugging from his mind like a warm string, he slammed the lever forward. The blade rushed downward, slicing off the girl's head to fall in the basket. Someone in the audience screamed, which brought a wellspring of pride to his chest. With the headless body clamped to the guillotine, Luca stepped to the edge of the platform and leered at the crowd. "Who amongst you will die next?" After brief and scattered applause, there was a reluctant motion forward, but once a few people had indicated they were going to get in line, the others, not wanting to miss out, followed. While customers sorted themselves, Luca threw a sheet over the girl's body, then pushed the lever back into position. Out of sight from the others, the cuffs released themselves, and a trapdoor opened, allowing the girl to exit the stage without being seen. The ephemeral illusion was gone, and the guillotine was back in position for the next customer. As Luca reached out to accept the next coin, he heard the girl tell her mother as they headed towards the shaved skin booth that getting her head chopped off had been wicked cool. With a critical mass of customers at his booth, Luca imagined their praises whirling outward like a virus until he had lines as long as the sparrows. This time as he ascended the stairs he conjured mist to rise beneath the platform, a moment of inspiration that brought a few oohs. As Luca settled the next customer, a gangly boy with messy hair, into the guillotine, an ambulance siren erupted nearby, startling him. The ambulance drove past his booth, going slow enough so that carnival-goers could get out of the way, its sirens going whoop whoop, as its red and blue lights reflected off the faces of everyone nearby. Everyone in his line was looking in the direction of the ambulance. An ominous black cloud rose above the location of the sparrow's booth, as if an alternate dimension had leaked into the carnival. A teenage girl in his line said loud enough for everyone to hear, 3 kids went nutso insane at the sparrow's booth. Like foaming mad. Twitching on the ground and everything, and they hadn't even gone into the box yet. The excitement in the girl's voice was a gut punch to Luca, only made worse when the majority of his customers left his line, headed in the direction of the flashing red and blue lights which had been swallowed by the black miasmic cloud. The tingling sensation of success was replaced with dread as he saw his opportunity slip away. But he did not let that affect his performance, and the few customers that stayed at his booth experienced their best possible death. Luca's booth became a dead zone after the ambulance. The fever-pitch excitement about the sparrow's booth traveled through the carnival like electricity. For the rest of the night, Luca only had a few more customers. He gave them his best work, conjuring blood spray the moment the blade kissed the neck and illusionary ravens to pick at the severed head in the basket. But as complimentary as they were about the experience, his lines were empty. Luca thought about conjuring illusionary customers to fill his ropes, but decided he wasn't that desperate yet. He still had a few more nights before Halloween. Sometime after the witching hour, the carnival closed, and Luca hurried to the sparrow's booth to catch a glimpse of the action. Luca had been expecting an elaborate setup, and was shocked to find a simple black box the size of an overlarge coffin at the center of a maze of velvet ropes, the detritus of old cups and gum wrappers lying on the ground. The sparrow was chatting with a couple of 5th years, who had grown bone wings for the carnival. She was built like a weightlifter, with humongous thighs that could crack watermelons. Her shock of short bone-white hair contrasted with the black militaristic outfit complete with numerous buckles and straps. Luca almost expected to see a riding crop in her hand. After learning nothing from his brief surveillance, Luca fussed with his booth for a few hours before heading to bed around sunrise. "Hey Randy. You got a sec?" Luca asked the shambling mound of mulched leaves and partially decayed flesh moving past his booth. Slow as a zombie on downers, Randy curled back. He looked up, and the smell of sulfur and rotting garbage almost knocked Luca off the execution platform. A gurgle came out of Randy's lips. He commonly known as Randy the Rotten in Oestomancium Hall. The 4th year had been trying to give his skin the ability to photosynthesize, but so far had only been able to turn his flesh into plant material. He was still as healthy as a horse, but he stunk like a landfill. "Any idea what the sparrow is doing with that box?" asked Luca, trying really hard to breathe through his mouth. "Glurg the sleeger sane," said Randy with as much emotion as a turtle. "A never-tell enchantment," Luca said despondently. "I'll never figure it out." "The logo ra?" asked Randy. "No, not so great. Everyone's flocking to the sparrow's booth." Randy made a disgusted face, which would have made a Medusa blanch. "Sorry. Unintended pun. I'd really hoped to have a shot at winning top solo booth this year, but she's killing me. You can see her lines from here, so everyone who thinks about stopping decides to head to hers, and with such long lines they never have time to come back." Randy shrugged, or maybe he coughed. It was hard to tell under all that dead plant material, but then he motioned towards his booth on the other side of the carnival. The gate didn't open for another hour, but it might take him that long to get there. "Lupus Pine," said Randy before he left. Luca wasn't sure if Randy had said "cut her throat" or "up your game," but either version gave him an idea. The next night, a 10-foot-tall Grim Reaper in billowing robes patrolled the wooden platform, wielding a scythe made from a shard of moonlight. When the first customer, a heavy-set man with a beer belly and a bald spot, ascended the rickety stairs, the Lord of Death pressed him onto a chunk of hardwood, where chains circled his arms. "What the hell?" asked Mr. Beergut, but his cries were drowned out by a chorus of damned souls. The Grim Reaper brought his shimmering scythe down, slicing the man's head off to tumble onto the platform. His blank eyes stared at the people who had assembled to watch, daring them to object. When the beheading was over, a white mist covered the platform, giving Mr. Beergut a chance to leave by way of the hidden staircase. Luca watched as an older couple made the decision to get into his meager line, while the rest of the bystanders moved on, half of them returning to the ghostly glow of their cell phones as they shuffled off like zombies. Before he let the older gentleman with white hair ascend the stairs in hopes of improving the experience, Luca asked Mr. Beergut a question before he moved on into the night. "What made you decide to try my booth?" Mr. Beergut chewed on the question before responding, "The line down yonder was longer than I cared to wait." As Luca prepared the next customer, a cheer went up at the Sparrows' line. They'd been yelling and screaming all night, not in fear but in celebration, as if each person coming out of the box was lucky to be alive. Towards the end of the night, when his line hadn't had a customer in a half hour, Luca chained the closed sign, dismissed the Grim Reaper from the platform, and headed towards the Sparrows' booth. Even after 1 in the morning, with only an hour left before closing, the line was jammed full. What struck Luca first was the number of teenagers, university students and young professionals in their suits. The only people that had visited his booth were either still in middle school or signing up for AARP. Not only were the millennials waiting in line, but they were talking face to face, with only the occasional glance at their cell phones, keeping a watchful eye on the black box at the center of the maze, as if Jesus riding a unicorn might appear at any moment. When the box shook for a second and a delirious-faced young woman stumbled from it, the crowd cheered. She fell to one knee, and a couple of guys in flannel shirts who were in line next helped her to her feet. She weaved away from the black box as if she'd been drinking all night. Luca watched as each customer came out of the black box with a different expression: fear, excitement, terror. But each one had an underlying enjoyment of the experience, especially when the crowd reacted to them. Listening to the ones that had been in the box already didn't help Luca figure out what she was doing either. Everyone had a different theory. The box was a gateway to Cthulhu's mind. They were flashed with a mind implant of their evil twin, spider kittens, injected an LSD-like poison creating a nanotrip, and so on. Each one sounded plausible to Luca except the spider kitten part, but in truth he couldn't comfortably rule that out either. Which left him with no earthly or unearthly idea how the Sparrow was doing it. He would have suspected that she was using charms, or putting an enchantment on their minds, but that was strictly illegal by the rules of the carnival, and the professors monitored the booths from afar to make sure everything was above board. While he moved up the line he watched the Sparrow for clues, but she looked almost bored, taking the coins, 3 full souls, and sending them into the box. It was infuriating. He'd worked so hard on his booth, yet she seemed to be cheating in some way he couldn't fathom. "You can't be here," said the Sparrow when he finally reached the end of the line. "You know that's against the rules." He hadn't done anything to hide his appearance, hoping she wouldn't care. While it was against the rules to experience other students' booths, most looked the other way because it was fun to scare the crap out of your friends. The Sparrow was not his friend, obviously. A guy in a muscle shirt tried to push past Luca when he didn't move towards the box. "I know you're cheating. I don't know how, but I know it. There's no way you can have these big lines without breaking the rules," he said. The Sparrow glanced away as if she hadn't even heard him. When she looked back and saw Luca still standing before her, she sighed and said, "You're interfering with my customers." Go back to your booth. If I see you back here again, I'll get you disqualified. In the hour before sunrise, the carnival was empty except for the men in light blue overalls removing the porte-mages and replacing them with fresh ones, the beeping of their lift truck playing over the distant traffic noise. The need to figure out the Sparrow's booth made Luca duck under the velvet ropes, even when a twinge of guilt hit him in the gut. If she's doing nothing wrong, then there's no harm in this, he muttered. Luca caught a whiff of stale beer and old barf before he reached the black box. It reminded him of the monolith from the movie 2001, which had been full of mystery and wonder if he could believe some of the people who'd stumbled out of it. He wrenched the door open, half expecting it to be locked, and stepped inside. The door was sturdy, well built, he had to give her that. The box seemed substantial, as if it had been here long before the carnival or the city. Luca hesitated before he shut himself inside, a little cocktail of fear and anticipation brewing inside his chest. What if I truly go mad? What if the box injures me and no one is around to help? Before he closed the door, a familiar voice drifted through the gap. The Sparrow had returned. Luca crashed out, spotting her near the funnel cake booth headed his way. He spun around to the opposite side of the box, and Skitter hunched beneath the circling ropes like some sort of bobbing spider creature, until he was safely away, hiding behind the candy-coated eyeball booth. The Sparrow wasn't wearing her normal witch dominatrix outfit, but a white tank top and ragged jean shorts. She yanked out a plastic bag and started scooping trash inside. When her back was safely to him, Luca crept away, circled back to his booth, and stared at his platform. It was frustrating. Except for a simple box, she'd barely put any effort into her booth. His was filled with horror accoutrements, little details like the faces of the damned appearing in the mist right before the Reaper took their head off. He would have to go bigger, he decided. Overwhelm his customers with sensory details until they could feel the danger. Or maybe it wasn't enough that they felt the danger. They had to know it was real, until the hairs on their arms prickled to life. As if they'd been trapped in a basement with a serial killer. Luca had an idea. It had the chance to be brilliant, but it could just as easily get him killed, or more likely, kill one of his customers. It would be skirting the edges of the rules, well, maybe trampling them, but it sure seemed like the Sparrow was doing the same. He returned to his room at the hall and collected the necessary implements, a fistful of paint markers, a cup of bat blood, and his old baby tooth. There were no classes in the 100 halls about summoning demons, but it wasn't really that hard to bring about a minor imp or familiar. What it required was a willingness to make a bargain. As the carnival opened and potential customers eyed his booth with trepidation, Luca crowed his new slogan, "Dance with the devil himself. Feel his icy fingers in your soul." At the twitch of his fingers, blasts of flame burst from the four corners of the platform. Screams echoed across the pavement, bouncing off the funnel cake booth, loud enough to be heard from one end of the carnival to the other. A shadow ripped from the clouds above, like a piece of torn cloth, transformed into winged shape, and descended upon the platform until it landed with a thump. "Come, my children. Sacrifice yourself to me." Luca swelled with pride at the theatrics until he glanced upon the crowds shuffling past, heads down in their cell phones or looking ahead in anticipation at the Sparrow's booth. A couple of aging dudes in Harley t-shirts were the lone attendees in his line. "Welcome to your doom," Luca said to the guy in front, who had a graying goatee. He and his friend were a bit past their prime, but their faded tattoos marked them as part of a local biker gang. If Luca could scare them, his booth would get lots of attention. "Let's get this party started," the man said, punctuating his comment with a beer-soaked belch. "Figure it's good enough for a laugh." His buddy elbowed him in the back, and they shared a chuckle that dispelled Luca's buoyant mood. "Follow me," said Luca, hoping the experience would change his tone. When the guy with the goatee ascended the stairs, he stopped halfway and said to his buddy, laughing, "Remember when we were in Vietnam? Now that was some scary shit." "Hurry up, Don," said the second guy. "I need another beer before we check out that weird chick's box." They laughed at the joke, which only infuriated Luca further. When Don reached the platform, he put his hands up WWE style. "I'm gonna take me down, the man in black himself." While this was going on, Luca was red-faced, thankful that the two men were paying attention to each other, not to him. Luca signaled the demon, who grabbed Don by the shoulders and thrust him onto his knees as mist swirled around him. Don kept his hands up, making whooping noises as if he were on a roller coaster. The crowd that had been filtering past the booth had stopped to stare, mirth on their faces. Even as the shadow demon loomed over him, Don puffed up even more and told the crowd, "I've had farts scarier than this shit." "Silence, mortal," said the shadow demon. "Silence, windbag," said Don, who struggled to stand despite the restraints, which was messing with the illusion since it expected the kneeler to be bent over. Based on the position of the shadow demon, it looked like Don was performing a sex act. His buddy caught this and yelled out, "Give a round of applause for Don the amazing demon for later." A roar of laughter erupted from the crowd, which had grown from the spectacle. When the demon brought its blade down upon Don's head, not where it was but where it was supposed to be, and the illusionary head appeared and tumbled forward, Luca was almost blind with shame. "See," cried his buddy, "Don just gave head." At this, the crowd's laughter descended into madness. Luca was left mute and motionless as a statue. Eventually, Don was released from the platform to stumble out the bottom, arms raised in victory. Passersby clasped him on the shoulder in appreciation. His voice in his throat, Luca looked at the next man in line and managed to croak out, "Are you next?" Don's buddy threw a couple of coins in his direction. "Nah, I'm good. Thanks for the laughs." When it was over, a few people in the crowd gave him coins, but no one got in line. What he made from the scene was barely what the sparrow made every few minutes. Despondent, Luca chained the closed sign at the entrance, dismissed the shadow demon. The favor he'd granted would come at a later and probably inconvenient time, but such was the nature of demons, and sat with his legs dangling off the end of his platform. He watched the crowds with their ever-present cell phones, narrowly avoiding each other as they flowed from booth to booth, barely aware of their surroundings. "What chance do I have against those?" Luca mused. He didn't know where he'd gone wrong with his booth, but those phones seemed like the key. Nobody at the Sparrow's booth spent more than a glance on theirs, afraid they might miss something. Not only was he not going to beat the Sparrow, he was destined to end up in last place with only one day left, Halloween. He'd hoped to translate a good result into a primo design job at one of the big live entertainment companies when he graduated at the end of the year, but no one would touch him now that he was in last place. With his head leaning against the smooth wooden railing, thoughts swirling through his head, Luca fell asleep, mouth sagging open. "Luca, wake up." Someone was shaking his foot. He had a huge knot in his neck, and his mouth was dry as sand. The sounds of crowds chattering had been replaced with the beeping of lift trucks. Forcing one eye open, he looked down at the Sparrow. Her shock of white hair was like a pale, motionless flame perched on her head. "You okay?" she asked, one eyebrow raised with concern etched into her brow. "Why do you care?" he asked. "Of course I care. We're from the same hall. I mean, you can't make a carnival booth for shit, but that doesn't mean I don't care, in like a distant, empress towards her slaves kind of way," she said, a grin hitched to her lips. It took him a moment to realize she was joking. "Yeah, thanks, Sparrow." "Julianne," she said. He knew that, but it was hard to think of her as anything but the Sparrow. "I heard about those assholes." "Nah, they weren't assholes. My booth sucks," he said. "Seems like the harder I tried, the worse it got. I wish I knew the secret, whatever it is that you're doing at your booth." She gave him a big ruby-lipped grin, a grin that set his heart to thumping. "I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing, but I'll give you a hint. Your illusions, while top of the line, are useless against our real adversary." "What?" he asked. "The answer is in those little boxes everyone carries around with them." Then she squeezed his foot and added, "Anyway, good luck. I've all but won again this year, but maybe you can put in a good showing for the last day. I'd hate to see you get beat by a bunch of underclass men." Long after she left, Luca stared at the place she'd been standing. The little boxes everyone carried around with them. Cell phones. What did they have in them? Everything. Every answer to every question. An ideal form of entertainment for each person on the planet, serving every need. He thought back to the various iterations of his booth, each time trying to up the action like some inflated CGI movie. People didn't care about beheadings or death or even demons, they could see worse on their phones. Magic was just a form of technology with different rules. They had every answer imaginable, and some that defied imagination, in those little boxes, and Luca realized he couldn't compete with that. Which led to his understanding of why and possibly how the sparrow, Julianne, was drawing such big crowds. The first thing he did was call his cousin, who was a programmer in Detroit. It took an agreement on spells to be named later, but his cousin dropped his current project to whip up a quick and dirty app. Once he had him working on his program, Luca got to work on the spells he would need to tie it all together. He had no chance of winning this year, that bat had already flown, but he could go out with his dignity or die trying. When the crowds returned to the carnival for the final night on Halloween, many hurried to get in line at the Sparrow's booth, as the word on social media proclaimed that it was the wildest, most heart-pounding of experiences that should not be missed. As they went, cell phones clutched in their hands, many slowed at the place where a booth used to be. It had been replaced by a single pillar 15 feet tall. Upon this unadorned pillar was a simple student with dusty blonde hair and normal-length arms, wearing a plain white t-shirt and jeans. There was no rope line to enter, no box to deposit coins in, no carnival barker trying to goad people into joining the experience. There was simply a sign on the bottom of the pillar that gave a link for an app. When the end of the first hour neared, a booming voice erupted from the pillar. "You have 2 minutes to vote. Choose wisely." Most of the gawkers chose to get in line at the Sparrow's booth. A few curious souls downloaded the app. They were confronted with a simple yes or no. The decisions were nearly split, though they didn't know their votes didn't matter. The end result of this first hour was predetermined. When the hour came to a close, the voice said, "The first burden." A wave of electricity climbed up the pole and captured Luca in a cage of agony. He screamed with the intensity of cattle being slaughtered. A few people actually put their hands over their ears. After 30 seconds of screaming, the electricity crackled into nothingness. Luca's shirt was soaked through with sweat. His mouth was dry and he could barely see straight. He realized with absolute certainty that he would have fallen off had he not enchanted his feet to the pillar. This also meant he had no choice but to finish what he'd started. The voice returned, "The next vote will begin in 58 minutes. Luca watched the crowd gathering below, the ghostly light of their cell phones illuminating their faces as they downloaded his app. As the next hour neared, they pointed their cameras at him, took selfies, and discussed what the next burden would be. At the nearing of the second hour, a now familiar booming voice erupted from the pillar. "You have 2 minutes to vote. Choose wisely." This time they knew exactly what to do. He saw the wave of voting spread from the area around his booth. The voice boomed at the close, "The burden of insects." A horde of hungry black beetles with fierce mandibles burst from the soil and climbed the pole in a carpet of chattering. He was cold with sweat as the insects approached. When he'd designed the summonings, he'd thought about faking it, using illusions. But he knew that they'd see through his inauthenticity. They'd know he was faking it. They needed more than spectacle, they needed a reason to care. Every person in the carnival, even those standing in the Sparrow's line and the Sparrow herself, trained their cell phone on the pillar as the insects overtook him. When it was finished, his muscles shook from the agony of clenching and unclenching. He could hardly see past the sweat in his eyes and was too tired to lift his arms to wipe it away. While the creatures did no permanent damage, the ache of pain still lingered in his mind. After a minute, an illusionary scoreboard appeared in the air. Yes, 323. No, 288. The result was closer than he'd thought, and with more votes than he expected. The voice boomed out, 56 minutes until the burden of ice. This time Luca watched as people lingered beneath his pole. He heard them discussing whether or not to make him suffer. When it got near the appointed hour, Luca noticed a camera being set up and trained on him. He tried to look resolute even though dread was building in his gut like hot oil. At the final 10 seconds, the crowd chanted the countdown like it was Times Square on New Year's Eve. He took a deep breath as the decision approached. When he'd set it up, he'd expected the first couple of burdens to be approved by the masses out of curiosity and because they really didn't understand what they were voting for, but then later ones to be voted down because people wouldn't want to cause him pain. It seemed like a safe bet at the time. As the swirling vortex of ice crystals battered his flesh and tore at his eyes, he lamented his miscalculation. When the third burden was complete, the voting results brought ooze from the crowd. Yes, 7,321. No, 7,002. It wasn't the closeness of the results that brought the reaction, but the number of votes. While there might be 14,000 people at the carnival, there was no way all the votes were coming from it. The voting had reached outside the carnival. Every vote came with a small payment equivalent to the soul coins. Luca lifted his head enough to confirm the camera was still trained on him. As he realized there was a chance he might win the contest, he also realized he might not be alive to enjoy it. When the fourth burden hit, the burden of wings, and 1,000 ravens descended to peck him mercilessly, he thought the ravages of his flesh might dissuade the yes vote. But on the fifth, the burden of sand, with the yes vote of 191,123 to 54,909, Luca realized there would be no relief. There was an odd disconnect between the people in the carnival and the votes coming from outside. With his eyes closed and his head hanging, he could hear the overwhelming majority beneath him, hoping that the no votes would carry the day. But each time the yes votes won and the burdens continued. Whatever the people in the carnival were experiencing, it had become too real for them, while those outside were only watching pictures on their tiny screens. The sixth, the burden of snakes, left Luca bloated and bleeding pus from thousands of sores. The seventh, the burden of stones, left him purple with bruises. By the time the final burden approached, the burden of fire, the vote totals were hitting the millions. His ear holes were swollen shut, the bones in his fingers were shattered, and he couldn't see out of his left eye. He hadn't expected to endure every burden, which meant spells protecting his long-term health were tasked to their limits. This final event might be the death of him. When the final countdown began, no one chanted. They watched, glued to Luca as he was to the pole. Through a bleary right eye, Luca searched for the sparrow, hoping she might stand beneath, but even she couldn't watch what he'd done to himself. At the moment the countdown hit 0 and no fire came, a palpable relief spread through the carnival. It took 3 firemen on a ladder to get Luca down from the pole. He spent a month in the hospital, receiving the best care possible. At first everyone had his name on their lips, talking about how the world had finally voted no. From his hospital bed, he watched them congratulate themselves on finally coming to their senses. But in time the fame faded, and when he was able to walk out of the hospital, he was back to relative anonymity. It wasn't until he watched the footage that he really understood what had happened. In the aftermath of the final vote, he noticed that there was no vote count displayed. Curious, he contacted his cousin who had made the app to find out what had happened. Only after Luca threatened his cousin with a curse did he admit what had transpired. It was the weirdest thing. I was glued to my phone like everyone else in the world, wondering what would happen when a call came through. I wouldn't have picked it up, but it said it was from you. There was a girl on the other end, and she told me that if I didn't shut it down, she'd pull my balls off and feed them to me through a straw. The way she said it made me believe her. She a friend of yours or something? Not really, said Luca. Anyway, continued his cousin, it's not like it mattered. You got what you wanted. You won the carnival. I bet those job offers will be coming in like an avalanche. Yeah, said Luca, feeling a little obtuse, like he'd missed something important. But what was the final total? Was it close? When I shut the app down, the data was lost. We'll never know. Are you sure? Asked Luca, feeling desperate. Can't you go back and recover it somehow? Is there anything you can do? Does it matter? They voted against you on the first 7. Why would the last make any difference? I might have died. There was a pause on the other end. After a time, Luca said, I don't know. I guess I hoped people might have come to their senses. That people cared. Yeah, me too, Luca. Me too. As he hung up the phone, he realized that at least one did. It only took a few minutes to find her number and punch it in. Hello, came the familiar voice on the other side. It's me, Luca. I was hoping you'd call. This has been The Ghostly Light of Hallows Eve by Thomas K. Carpenter.